Good evening, all. Tonight we are talking about our final era of ethical history, that is the contemporary era, and then we will be discussing Jean-Paul Sartre. So here we go. When we talk about the contemporary, this is obviously something that changes a little bit. The early modern, we said, was fairly locked in for our purposes from 1588, the birth of Thomas Hobbes, to 1900, the death of Friedrich Nietzsche. And that was a special appearance by my rooster. When we talk about the contemporary, we mean the period of history that's still in living memory. So obviously, the period that we're in now is going to change in terms of label when future historians are looking back at it retrospectively, or specialists in various specialties of art or architecture and so on. And they will indefinitely relabel this. But what we're looking at here is approximately 80 years, about the lifespan of a normal human. Or another person, or another way that we might look at this is a generation gap. So about a 30-year period also. Just when we're thinking about moral philosophy in general, remember this is one of the most active areas of philosophy now. There are certainly specializations. We've talked about philosophy of law, a little bit about philosophy of religion, and philosophy of science, very other specialty courses. But moral philosophy is where you're going to find most philosophers who are not employed at Starbucks or driving a taxi cab are going to be working in moral philosophy because this is the most employable area. We've approached value questions for the most part at a level of abstraction. So we may have talked about contentious issues, and recall your term paper asked you to do this specifically, either with things like abortion or stem cell research, illegal immigration, and so forth. But we've talked about them at an abstract level, that is, the broad spectrum issue, not a specific instance thereof. But for most of the 20th century, moral philosophers were more concerned with meta-ethics than with actual normative ethics. So kind of an overview, we've talked about some of the questions that we address. What is the nature of right action? What does justice require of us? Which virtues must we have or practice to make a good life? Are there universally valid moral principles? What's the basis of our moral obligations? And finally, where do we find the source of our moral motivation? And in the main way that we're looking at, we've done this through normative ethics. This is what we spent the bulk of our semester together doing. Utilitarianism, Kantian deontology, virtue theory, and existentialism are all examples of normative ethical theory. Applied ethics is exactly what it sounds like, where we take those normative ethical theories and we're applying them to contemporary social issues. This would include things like physician-assisted suicide, capital punishment, affirmative action, justification of war, and so forth. Meta-ethics is talking about how we talk about ethics. This is where we're going to find our definitions of the good, the bad, the right, and so forth. And we'll tend in meta-ethics to kind of abstract away from making normative ethical claims without committing ourselves to a normative view. Now, generally speaking, if I've got a specific idea about good and bad or good and evil, it's going to lend itself more or less well to specific ethical theories, but we generally try not to get too hung up on any one of those. So rather than go over some of the characters that we didn't have time to read for whatever reason, we're going to jump right into Jean-Paul Sartre. So if you're following along in our home game, you're going to want to go to slide 39, where we've got a wonderful portrait of Sartre, and we have his summative quotation right there below him. Excuse me. To say that we invent values means nothing else but this: life has no meaning a priori. It is up to you to give it a meaning. So to unpack that a little bit, remember, a priori means prior to experience. It's the opposite of a posteriori, after experience. But what he's saying here is that we've got to create our own meaning for our own lives. So he would tell us that defining existentialism is fairly easy. The problem is later when we try and understand what that definition means. So his definition of existentialism is this: existence precedes essence. So existence, you've got to exist, precedes, comes before, and essence, what you are fundamentally. So if we were to boil you down, distill you, and all that kind of thing, what would be left of you? Okay. Sartre's contention here is that there is no fixed human essence, and this finds itself at odds with a lot of the classical views. Remember, most of our early virtue thinkers were interested in what is the nature of human nature. That is, what are we fundamentally? And if we're not that now, how do we guide ourselves onto that one path? But if there is no fixed human essence, there's nothing to give us a series of objective values. that can guide our actions and give meanings to our lives. We really have no way of knowing in this context whether or not we are living the best possible life according to someone else's model, because others' models really don't mind or really don't impact us all that much. We're thrown into the world, and as individuals, we're both free, there's a cattail for you, free and confronted with the challenge of choosing our own values and what we're going to be. Here, let me say hi, Vesper. This is Vesper. Each of us, what we become depends on our autonomous decisions and on our actions. As we live our lives, we're creating ourselves, but we're also creating a set of values. So Sartre's existentialism here, it's a philosophy of radical freedom. You are free to do absolutely anything you want to do. And yes, that means beyond the realms of legality and so forth, but you're also radically responsible. You can't shift the blame onto anyone but yourself, because this is ultimately individual human self-creativity, what he's talking about. Now, he tells us that while existentialism began with a Christian whom we've studied, Soren Kierkegaard, it's since split into two divergent paths. There's the Christian path, represented by Kierkegaard, and then the atheistic path, represented by Sartre himself. And in case you're curious, Nietzsche was somewhere in between these. We might say that Nietzsche was spiritual, but not particularly religious, and he's the only person in history that can get away with that without sounding like a douche. Now, one of the fantastic things about Sartre is that most of his writing is not in the form of bulky philosophical treatises. He does have some of those. If you ever want your brain to hurt, you can pick up a copy of his Being and Nothingness. But most of it is in really, really good literary pieces, in plays, in novels, in short stories. So good, in fact, that he was offered the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1964, but famously refused to accept it. One of the, or the play that we were to watch on the final evening of class, and lamentably we cannot now have our potluck, I will be sending you a link to, and you can see what you think for yourself about that. So a bit about Sartre. He was born in Paris in 1905, studied German philosophy in Berlin. That's what was really where he was going to find the base of his existentialism. He was active in the French resistance in the underground during World War II, which is really pretty cool. Kind of the leader of the French intellectual avant-garde, and died in 1980. So his first key concept there, that existence precedes essence. This is that notion that there is no fixed human essence or nature prior to human choice. There is nothing that provides us an objective set of values. So let us say, for instance, that we were to tell you that my rooster is going to make frequent appearances, it seems like. His name is Stockholm, because we suspect he has the syndrome. Now, let us say that the best possible life was to be married, to have a job, to have 2.5 children, live in a house in the suburbs. And that's the best possible life. But you don't want that life. So does that mean you can never live the best life? Sartre would say, well, of course not. What that means, rather, is that you have to find what the best possible life would look like for you. There's nothing else that's going to guide your actions. His notion of subjectivism, this is that idea that values really have no objective basis. Okay? Sartre accepts this idea of subjectivism because he believes, and I believe, that our values depend on our individual choices and commitments. That is to say, we accept those things which we accept because we're free to do so. There's really nothing to say that we have to be whatever it happens to be. It is rather our choice to be that thing or not to be that thing. Okay? So jumping right in, we've got those two kinds of existentialists, Christian and atheistic. And so, wow, the rooster's really going nuts. Sartre says that what they have in common is that existence precedes essence, or subjectivity has to be our starting point. And of course, in subjectivity, we are the subject, whoever we happen to be, okay? Now, in the reading I asked you to take a look at for Sartre, he mentions the paper cutter. And he says, inspiration comes from a concept. At once, an object produced in a certain way, and on the other hand, one having a specific use. And one cannot postulate a man who produces a paper cutter, but doesn't know what it's used for. Now, most of us probably think of the kind of paper cutter that we've seen in classrooms or workrooms or at the office or whatever. He doesn't mean that exactly. He means what we would probably call a letter opener. What in the play I'm going to ask you to watch, they're going to call a paper knife. Now, Here is why that's important. If you think back to The Great Gatsby, either the book or the most recent movie with Leonardo DiCaprio, there's that scene where they're in the library with Owl Eyes, and Owl Eyes is going through Gatsby's library, and he's impressed by it. He says, "They're real books. The pages haven't even been cut open yet." Now, what he's talking about is a deckle-edged book. It's kind of got this weird, uneven cut to the end of the pages, and that's just not showing up really well. But it used to be that books were formed in one long continuous strip, then accordion folded, saddle stitched together, and when you would get a new book, in order to read it, you would have to cut open every other page, leaving this very distinctive looking deckle edge. Now, that's why you have a paper cutter, and that's why some books are still printed with a deckle edge, kind of as an homage to them. They don't have to print them that way anymore, but it's kind of cool that they do that. So here's what he's saying. You need that item, or you need that function, and so you create that item. You may have heard the phrase that necessity is the mother of invention. You got to get something done, and so you invent something to do that very specific thing. Whatever we're considering, he says that when God creates, he knows exactly what he's creating. So the individual man is a realization of a certain concept in the divine intelligence. And you may be saying to yourself, well, wait a minute, I thought this guy was an atheist. And indeed he is. He's what I'm going to call a reluctant atheist here in a bit. And I'll explain why. What this means, though, is that we exist. We turn up. We appear on the scene, and only afterwards do we define ourselves by our choices and our commitments. If man, as the existentialist thinks of him, is indefinable, it's because at first he's nothing. And ladies, this of course includes you, men in the sense of anthropos, men, women, humans, people, us. Okay? Only afterward are you something, and you are what you will have made yourself. He says there is no human nature since there is no God to conceive of it. So he's kind of working backwards on a traditional disproof of God's existence. He's leaning heavily on the we are created in God's own image, but he's saying since we're all so different, or since the best possible life seems to define each of us on an individual level, there must be no God. It's not a really good argument, but it's the one that he's going with. So we're going to stick along with that. So he tells us then, not only is man what he conceives himself to be, but also what he wills himself to be after his thrust towards existence. So we didn't ask to be here, and yet here we are. And now we've got to make all of the rules for ourselves. We have to determine what we are, because we are nothing else but what we make of ourselves. This is the first principle of existentialism. He says, first we exist, we hurl ourselves towards the future, and we're conscious of imagining ourselves as being the future. In fact, we have a very difficult time imagining the future without ourselves in it. Okay? So we've also got to think of it this way. Not only are we what we create ourselves, but we are what we've planned to be. Not necessarily what we want to be. I want to be a millionaire playboy cruising the Riviera with the Swedish bikini team, but that's just not in the cards. We aren't even what we need to be. I need to be a millionaire playboy, and so on and so forth. But I'm neither of those things. I am what I have planned to be. It takes an awful lot of schooling to do this, believe it or not. And one degree led into another degree and into another degree and so on and so forth. And indeed, that's kind of why we're all here. We have plans, whether to be a philosophy professor or a nurse or an engineer or what have you. And we seek out those plans, and that is what we create in ourselves. When we say will, we mean a conscious decision. That's subsequent to what we've already made of ourselves. All these desires that we might have of, if I get this degree, I can do this job, is really just a manifestation of an earlier, more spontaneous choice called will. I remember I was sitting in Dr. Pullman's 7 a.m. organic chemistry lecture and said, this sucks, but I do kind of like this philosophy stuff and I can probably do that instead. That was a fairly spontaneous choice, but that involved will. If existence really does precede essence, there's a catch. We are fully and solely responsible for what we are. So existentialism's first move then is to make all of us fully aware that the full responsibility rests on us. Now, this isn't just that it rests on us individually, but that we're responsible for everybody else. And that's a lot of responsibility. The word subjectivism then takes on a couple of different meanings. One, it means we choose and make ourselves, but it's also means that it's impossible for us to transcend human subjectivity. In other words, Each one of us comes from a certain educational background, religious background, political background, and so on and so forth, cultural background, and so on and so forth. And we can't really leave that aside. We can look at things objectively. We can view it without inserting our own opinions or thoughts onto it, but we can never completely get away with having those opinions or thoughts on it. You know, if we were to be anthropologists or sociologists going to some, wild land somewhere far away and watching what we might see as fairly primitive or barbaric customs, it's going to be next to impossible, says Sartre, for us not to go, wow, that's barbaric, or that's really different from what we do. And we don't necessarily mean it in a derogatory sense. It's just that we can't get rid of those things. And so in creating the people that we want to be, every one of our acts at the same time creates an image of people as we think they ideally all ought to be. To choose this or to affirm that, this is to say, this is what I think everyone should do. So we're kind of going back to something that we saw with Kierkegaard here, is we're choosing what we view as the best, even if it's not objectively the best for all people. We're always going to choose the good, and we don't think that anything can be good for us without being good for all. And so we kind of get trapped in this spiral of behavior. Now, we should always ask ourselves then, says Sartre, what would happen if everyone looked at things this way? So we're kind of applying Kant's categorical imperative here. And we could say that not everybody does that if we're trying to let ourselves off the hook for something, but it's just not going to work. And we have to reason with ourselves. And we get this kind of anguish because we really don't want to be responsible for ourselves. Adulting sucks. Much less do we want to be responsible for other people. And yet Sartre says we're fully responsible for them as well. And he tells us, and this is why I call him a reluctant atheist, he says the existentialist thinks it's very distressing that God doesn't exist because all possibility in finding values in a heaven of ideas disappears along with him. There can no longer be an a priori good since there is not an infinite and perfect consciousness to conceive of it. Because nowhere outside of religious context is it said that that the good exists, that we have to be honest, that we ought not to lie, because he says we're on a plane where it's only us. And he quotes Dostoevsky here, not Dostoevsky, but actually one of Dostoevsky's characters from the Brothers Karamazov, which I highly recommend to you. Put it on your bucket list, read it before you die. You'll be better for having done so. Dostoevsky says, if God didn't exist, everything would be possible. And Sartre says this is the very starting point of existentialism. Indeed, everything's permissible if God doesn't exist, because no one's there to punish you, but no one's there to reward you either. We find ourselves forlorn because we really don't find anything to cling to, and we can't make excuses for ourselves or our behavior. There is no determinism. There's no fatalism. Man is free. Man is defined as freedom. We're alone with no excuses. And he uses this condemnatory language. We're condemned to be free. Now, usually we think of being condemned in a very negative kind of a putative context, but here he means condemned because we didn't create ourselves, and yet in other respects we're completely free. But once thrown into the world, we're responsible for everything that we do. And so what happens is we waver between two kinds of ethics. On the one hand, we've got this ethics of sympathy, of personal devotion, characterized probably best for us by Hume. On the other hand, we've got a broader ethics, a universal ethics, but one whose efficacy, its effectiveness, is more dubious. We've got Kantian deontology, where we're trying to make universal rules, but we're also trying to do them on an a priori basis, rather than looking in the context of the actual experience. He says, how do we choose between them? Christian doctrine can't help us choose. You will believe in the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. That doesn't really help you pick one of those ethics. No one can decide a priori, that is, prior to experience, you can't determine which ethics is best for you. And finally, no book of ethics can tell us. So how do we pick one? If the values seem vague and they're always too broad for concrete and specific cases, the only thing left for us, says Sartre, is to trust our instincts. For instance, the only way to determine the value of affection is to perform an act which confirms and defines it. But you require that affection to justify your act. I don't know. Think of huggers. Some of you are huggers. Some of you are vehemently not huggers. If you are getting a hug from a hugger and you're not a hugger, you're just waiting for it awkwardly to stop. Maybe you do the let me go back pat. Okay? But you don't know whether you want that hug until you're in that hug. It's kind of where he's going with this. So he tells us that no general ethics can really show us what's to be done. There are no omens in the world. He says for the existentialist, there really is no love, there's no genius, there is nothing. We're involved in life, we leave our impress on it, and outside of that, we're nothing. We're nothing more than a series of undertakings that we're the sum of, the organization, the ensemble of these relationships. If we think back to Nietzsche from last week, and we recall poor Paul Ree, he's only remembered because Nietzsche said he was stupid. So when all is said and done, this isn't really pessimism, it's optimism. It's optimistic toughness, says Sartre. I've got to move the cat again. Say bye. Now, when the existentialist writes about a coward, he says the coward is responsible for their cowardice. They willed themselves to be that way. Progress would be betterment. Man is always the same. The situation confronting us varies, but choice always remains a choice in a situation. So the ultimate meaning of the acts of honest men is this quest for freedom, he says. We want freedoms for freedom's sake and in every particular circumstance. We don't want to be coerced into anything. We don't want anything determined for us. But in wanting our freedom, we discover it depends on the freedom of others, and their freedom depends on ours. And freedom can only really be our goal if we take their freedom as our goal as well. So what we've got then is man as a being in whom existence precedes essence, that we're free beings, that we want only our freedom, but at the same time, we really can want only the freedom of others. And he tells us, if I've discarded God the Father, there has to be someone to invent values for me. Now, Sartre, as an atheist, is saying he's getting rid of God, and yet he is creating his own values. Before we come alive, life is nothing, and we give it meaning. And the value is nothing but the meaning that we choose. In that way, we're creating a human community. We're creating this universe of human subjectivity. And that is where Sartre leaves us off. We will pick up tomorrow, or I'm sorry, not tomorrow. We will pick up next week with our very last lecture on John Rawls. And then we will all watch the Jean-Paul Sartre play, Huis Clos, No Exit. Thanks, and have a good one. Bye-bye.